Welcome to the Live Your Possible podcast, the show about sparking and discovering endless possibilities where we work, live, and play. A safe place where we can help you peel back the cover to what may be blocking you from being your most authentic and happiest self.
Welcome, Julie Kratz. She is a highly acclaimed TEDx speaker and inclusive leadership trainer who led teams and produced results in corporate America. After experiencing many career pivot points of her own, she started her own speaking business to help leaders be more inclusive, promoting diversity, inclusion, and allyship in the workplace. Julie helps organizations foster more inclusive environments. She's a frequent keynote speaker, podcast host, executive coach, and an author of 6 books. She holds an MBA from the Kelley School of Business at Indiana University and is a certified unconscious bias trainer. Julie and I had an open discussion today about diversity, equity, and inclusion, and hear all the buzzwords that might set you off. Listen and learn with an open heart to learn more about these words, to see your part in things and how you can make a real impact one relationship at a time. Enjoy the show. Julie Kratz, welcome to the show. I'm really excited to talk to you about what you're up to these days. And you have this really cool company name called Next Pivot Point. And I'd love to jump in right there. What is that name all about? Where's it come from?
Yeah. Well, it's been a journey, entering year 9 of business. But when I first started out, as a white, straight, cisgender, able-bodied woman, I thought, my voice in this diversity space had to do with gender. And it was at the same time that I was at a mid-career pivot point of my own making, leaving corporate, starting my own business. I was comparing notes with other women. And as they were sharing their challenges with me, and as I wrote my first book, based on those interviews, they shared, I don't feel like the workplace includes me. I don't feel like I'm fully seen. I'm not fully heard. I feel invisible. I'm not sure what I want to do with my life. There's got to be more. So that's where Pivot Point came in. And that was the title of my first book. Since then, what I've realized, and part of business ownership, is creating a brand and owning the domains and social handles. So while I couldn't get Pivot Point, I could get Next, because at the same time, women and now as allies, and now in the diversity work that I've expanded into over the last several years, it's people are asking what's next. And people often come to us and my team is what's next for diversity? What's next for gender? What's next, as allies, hopeful allies from a racial perspective. And so that's what I love to research. That's what I love to study and write about and talk about and do keynotes about. So that's where Next Pivot Point was born.
Yeah, that's really cool. And did you have some personal pivot points of your own that got you to go this path when you think about diversity, equity, inclusion?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, my corporate journey, I spent 12 years in a corporate environment, lots of different industries, functional areas, got my MBA. In all of those experiences, though, it was very common that I was the only woman in the room, especially as I ascended into leadership roles. It was very common that I managed men, and there wasn't a lot of other diversity on those leadership teams either. And so my pivot points were kind of these moments of realization of, hey, I thought the workplace was about equity and everyone has an equal chance, and this myth of meritocracy that we're all ingrained in our culture. And I came to this realization that no, that actually isn't true. It in fact is a myth. And what if we could do better? What if we could create a workplace that actually worked for everyone? And well, that's continues to be a utopian vision of mine. I do think there are simple practices, mindsets, behaviors that people can do to cultivate a culture of inclusion. And no one's going to be perfect, right? I'm not perfect. It's progress over perfection. I constantly make mistakes, and that's how I learn and grow. But what we're asking people to do is just to be better. Can we respect humans in the workplace? Can we ensure that diverse perspectives feel welcomed? I mean, these are baseline things that are woefully, just painfully behind in most corporate settings. You ask folks those questions. I mean, you get scores of like 30, 40% of folks feel those things. And fairness, respect, equity. I mean, these are natural human values that we have. They don't start and stop in the workplace.
Yeah. Why do you think we've gotten to that place where it's only 30, 40%? What do you think has happened?
Yeah, it's, the workplace was designed by one demographic for one demographic. So not a lot's changed in the last 80 years. The post-World War II era, the modern workplace is born, right? If anyone's watched the show Mad Men, you watch that show, I lived that in the 90s. Like, I don't know how much has changed. And based on what I see as a consultant on the outside now, I don't think it's as stark, right? But it may not be conscious. It may not be as overt as it was then. But when you create a workplace that kind of, it assumed a caregiver at home, it assumed, the man as the provider, it assumed a very segregated white, especially for, more of the white collar workforce. It's going to behoove that demographic. And that's still how it functions today. And how it's reinforced today is wealth and leadership is concentrated in that demographic. I mean, 90+% of wealth is controlled by white men in the world. That's the same amount of CEOs of Fortune 500 companies. And, even as you look down to the next tiers of leadership, women, folks of color are just, again, very low representation, mid-20s percentile at best. And so when you don't have people leading in control of power, of wealth in a capitalist society, then it leads to decisions that just reinforce that power staying with that very small group of people. And it's actually gotten considerably stronger and more concentrated over the last few decades than people realize. I think people know the middle class is shrinking, but what they don't understand is that wealth just continues to tighten and tighten and tighten. It's just not sustainable, right? It's not sustainable for us to continue to concentrate wealth and power in the hands of few. It's not a representation of democracy anymore.
Yeah, right. I mean, to your point, it's just influencing our world. What shapes us as far as what we buy, what we watch, what we listen to, what we believe, systemically across the board. And, for me, I recently had my own realization that I was pushing away people, pushing away differences, wasn't looking at equality as openly as I could or should. And there's really a lot of power in that. There's a lot of beauty in that. There's so much possibility in that. And this reminds me a little bit too about your TED Talk. I loved your TED Talk from a couple of years ago about, fit in or get out. And I love your stories around the fact that, the construction clothing, at least the boots and some other things, was only in male sizes. And it just reminds me of a lot of different things. And I'd love to hear a little bit more about the gender equality movement, what you're doing there, how that's coming to kind of fruition from your talk as well.
Yeah. And I appreciate you watching the talk, and listeners, love any feedback on that. That was a lot of work to get those TED Talks across the finish line. And of course, delivering it 1 week before the world shut down with the pandemic wasn't ideal timing for that. But I will say, where we're at with gender is it's sad. I mean, at one point during the pandemic, and I think it's gotten a little bit better, but at one point we had record low participation of women in the workforce predating 1980s. And so it's like we went backwards because we all know what happened, right? Kids are home, they need homeschooled. I heard so many stories of wonderful people that I know where the man was just like, nope, that's your job. Like, it was just assumed that a woman fully employed was going to do that job. And so many mental health crises. I mean, it's not humanly possible to do all of these things. I am not a school teacher. I did not do a very good job with my kindergartner. My husband did a much better job as the primary caregiver. But all that to say, where we're at with women right now and what we know globally. So Melinda Gates and the foundation, her and Bill, since they've parted, still run, what they've found, the systemic issues facing women. One, education. And this is a global issue, right? Here in the US, actually, women have more education than men, but we're not succeeding at least in a corporate representation perspective at the same rates as men, which is interesting. But globally, if we educate women, we can empower them, and not just them, but their communities. Women actually give back to their communities at higher rates. So it behooves the whole community versus an individual when we empower women and educate them. Two, sexual harassment and violence against women. I mean, unfortunately, and people thought this went away when we went away from the workplace, these Slack messages, these inappropriate emails, stuff that's happening on cameras, even in virtual work, sexual harassment is rampant. And I can tell you, when the Me Too movement broke out, I was like, at first I was quite honestly, even doing this work, I was in complete denial. Like, that didn't happen to me. No one did that to me. And then, I reflected a little deeper and I was like, oh, shoot, that did happen to me. Oh my gosh. It was so ingrained and normalized in the workplace. I didn't even know it was happening. Right. And so we have increased awareness with Me Too. And also it's created an undercurrent of fear. Unfortunately, like most movements, there's a backlash. So sexual harassment, I think, just pay attention. It's unfortunately way too common, and it's a super big risk, right? Like you don't want to take that legal risk. And then the third thing is parental leave. Unfortunately, still affects women because women are 70% of the primary caregivers here in the US. It affects women more so than men, but it is a human issue. Anybody that's a caretaker, anyone that's adopted a child, deserves to have some of that precious few weeks with them. Right. I went back to work after 5 weeks with my first baby and 2 weeks with the second. And I'm not proud of that. That's not okay. And because I'm the primary breadwinner, did not have a choice. I did not have access to paid leave. And 80% of women don't either. And of course, those in lower income are even more at risk, and their mortality risk. We have one of the highest mortality rates of women in our country as a developed country. It's unheard of in other developed countries. So we need to do better with women as caregivers. And if we don't, we're going to force more women to not have children. And our birth rate is declining because of this lack of support. And we economically need to replenish the workforce, especially with an aging demographic. So all of these issues affect all humans, not just women. We would all be better off if we addressed them.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you also talked in there as well about compensation, the gaps. And I had I recall a story with my daughter. She's now 14. And probably like 6-7 years ago, we were out to dinner, and out of the blue, I don't know if she had heard me talking about some of these elements with my wife as I was going through my own awakening. And she's like, Dad, I hope I make as much money as boys one day. And I was like, where did she hear this? What's going
14. On? Yeah. Well, good. Knowing is better than not knowing. Yeah. I didn't know. And then I was really ticked off later.
Well, she's actually 8 when she brought it up. I mean, we still talk about it now. She's 14, but it's pretty wild. You're right about knowing. And, I think there's been some examples I've seen where, like, if you have a speed limit sign, said men could drive, 60 and women could only drive like 42, because that's kind of like the percentage of compensation what people are allowed to pay women, it feels like. So I just thought that was really a really good way to display it. And you talk about it on your TED Talk. I just think it's good awareness for us to understand, because I just think there is a big gap. And I think folks don't see it. And even in same or like roles, same position, same background. And it's something that I had to take a long look at. And I really hope that other listeners that are leaders, managers, people that care about their people, to really take consideration of that, because it does matter.
Oh, yeah. 82 cents on the dollar. And that's stagnant. It's not improving. Women of color, it's even worse. It's very disappointing. And so you're right. And people love to make the excuses of, this is where you're going in your brain. Well, women take lower paying jobs. They're attracted towards nursing and education. Well, why are those jobs lower paid?
Right.
That's the question we should be asking. That's a systemic issue, not that women are encouraged to do those jobs. And then 2, really thinking about from an overall perspective, like why when we ask people for their starting salary, we ask for the history. So that just builds in systemic, again, redundancy around paying women less. So don't ask. It doesn't matter what they made before. It matters what you want to pay them now. And that's, again, good for all genders, all identities, because we, at the end of the day, tend to value women's work less than we do men's. I mean, if we just want to be honest about it, that's what we're signaling. And that doesn't feel good. You're never going to get the most out of all genders. The other thing I'd say, this has been well studied and documented, when a man becomes a father, he's seen as a provider, right? Most people associate men with providers and women with caregiving. It's been well studied from the implicit association test Harvard's done over the years. And so with that bias, we tend to pay women less and promote women less when they become mothers, and men more when they become fathers, because then they're providing for other people, which is not justified in performance.
Yeah,
right? You're not getting more out of that person. You just have a perception that they need it more than the other person. So it's just, it festers. The last thing I'll say is, this happened to me, and I hope it doesn't happen to your daughter, but I worked went into the workforce. I got a really good first job. I got the highest paying job offer of any of my friends. But then I go to work and doggone it, I'm working with 5 white guys that are all making at least 5 to 10% more than me. And I didn't find that out for about 6 months because, you have to you're not supposed to talk about that. And then we finally did. And I was like, what? Why? And they had told me in HR, which they probably shouldn't have at the time. They said I was the top performer in the interview, that I was ranked number 1 in the interview. So it wasn't because of my performance. What was it about? And then what ends up happening is that stagnates your future pay and promotion. So then I'm sitting in a different area of the pay band. Right. So when I get promoted, I'm going to make less than them. And it just compounds over time. So if I was still at that organization 20 years later, they would probably be making at least $20,000, $30,000 more a year than me. And maybe probably not performing as well. So this isn't good. This isn't good for anybody when we have these problems.
It doesn't make sense. And folks talk about it. To your point, there's no sense of trying to pretend that it's not being discussed. It's a real deal. And I also appreciate about the TED Talk, you talked about your mom, single mom, raising you, and how you shared some of the thinking, the strengths, the beliefs. And I loved with your daughter and how you really were looking to create a mindset of I am. You use I am statements. I am strong. I am a bunch of really powerful words. So she starts to believe it so she can be it. And I love that. I'd love to learn a little bit more from you about how you did, why you did that.
Yeah. Well, I think I borrowed the idea from not the best film on the planet, The Help. So if anyone's seen that movie, lots of saviorism, dynamic problems with that. But at the time, this was a long time ago, before I was aware of that, I remember watching it and be like, that's so empowering for this little girl. It was a good part of the movie was these I statements. I am strong, I am smart. And so it resonated with me. And when I had my daughter 9 years ago, I just remember holding her, and anyone that's held an infant in your arms, yours or someone else's, you see things. And as I spent more time with her, she really is strong, smart, beautiful, funny, kind, and brave. Those are she now has 6 words because we had to add kind and brave because we had some challenges over the years. And I was like, we got to rein this in. But she was always those things. As I looked into her little soul as a 9-month-old, I remember that's her essence. And maybe it's, when we get philosophical, it's kind of what I hope to be too. So reinforcing that, especially with our girls, because what happens is girls' confidence peaks at age 8. And I have a 9-year-old, right? That's really tough for me to admit out loud. How do we instill that confidence? Most nights we still do her words. And I now, back to my TED Talk, I found out I was pregnant shortly after that. So I now have a 2.5-year-old.
Nice.
And she has her words, fun, fierce, leader, because she is not going to let the world dictate things to her. I do not think she will take something like gender equality. She's not going to put up with it. Let's just say that about little Dill. And so she has her words too. And this is totally her essence. She is a very fierce human being and does not abide by anyone's rules but her own. And that's
great.
Hard now, but later in life, I know that will be very helpful. Right now, it's very difficult with not a fully formed brain, a lot of risk she takes that I don't love. But that's what we need to teach our kids. The founder of Girls Who Code, Reshma Sanjani, wrote about this in her book, Brave Not Perfect, did a TED Talk on it. I highly encourage listeners, if you want to instill bravery in our girls, and really all genders, this behooves all genders, we should be teaching them to be brave, not perfect. This whole idea of being perfect, not being bossy, not being too much this or that, it's a head spin for our kids. No one wants to fit in these silly boxes we orchestrated. So let people be their full human selves. If we had more brave girls, what would the world look like? That gets me excited, right? And for men, I don't have to be the only brave one. What a relief to not feel all that pressure too. So this equally benefits us all by letting ourselves be our full human selves.
Yeah, I agree with you. It definitely would benefit everybody. Not feeling like we have to have all the answers, no matter who you are, no matter what position you're in, being more inclusive of thinking and ideas, perspectives, and especially with the younger generations coming up, we are going to be influenced by them. And they're going to help us change and be more empathic with each other, more inclusive, more loving. All the words we're not supposed to use maybe a few years ago, maybe even today, for all I know, in certain companies, because I'm sure some people are still figuring that out. And it makes me think too of your book, your Little Allies book. It's something I actually referenced in my book because I thought it was a really great read. It's simple. It really teaches some really insightful lessons for folks in a children's book. And within my book, we need to slow down, get back to our childlike selves and thinking, filled with wonder, thinking about what are those simple messages that we're actually no longer actually following, like playing nice in the sandbox. We're not doing that anymore. So I'm just curious about where that book started for you. Was that your first book? Was that something that came out in a similar manner as far as thinking wise, as far as teaching different lessons?
Yeah, thanks for asking. The Little Allies is the children's book that we wrote, and I wrote, and it really is a collection of stories I've heard from folks with diverse backgrounds and perspectives. They're all based, it's little vignettes. So it's a fourth grade reading level, listeners. So if you have anybody that you know in your life, K through 5, it's appropriate. You want to read to them younger, and then hopefully they could read to you as they, get closer to that reading level. But at the time, my daughter was 6. So she was asking a lot of candid questions. Summer of 2020, right? Like everybody's like, what? How do I explain this? And she's 6 and just asking really genuinely curious questions. And I'm really struggling. Like, I do this work for a living. If I'm struggling with this, I bet a lot of parents, especially white parents, are really struggling right now. And I'm sitting there crying, trying to explain racial justice. And it's like, oh dear, this is, I don't want her to think it's like this sad thing. I want her to feel empowered. And so I got curious, and I have a podcast with my partner, Simone Morris, and it's called the Inclusion School Podcast. And we were interviewing all these parents and caregivers, educators about DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion. And you just hear these stories. You hear the story about the kid that identifies as gender non-binary and uses they, them pronouns and is misgendered at school, right? And no one knows what to do. And what if an ally was there to say, hey, I'm going to stand with you in this, right? And in the book, we talk about through the stories of, a kid being told they don't belong, because of their racial identity. Okay. We talk about being a quiet ally. It doesn't require the savior, especially like, I'm going to save the day for you. Like, that's not helpful, not sustainable, but rather teaching kids to be empathetic, to sit with the person. If a kid speaks Spanish as their primary language, what if you learned some Spanish and they learned English from you? Like, wow, then we could both be smarter, right? Instead of that kid feeling othered or less than because of the language their parents taught them in their house. Like, that's not a kid's fault. So, and I think the lesson I've learned and the stories I've heard from Little Allies has been parents, caregivers, educators learn a lot more from kids than they do. Like that. You're not actually doing the teaching when you read the book. They're teaching you. So if you're willing to get schooled by some young kids, and there's nothing more vulnerable than that. I mean, it's embarrassing sometimes when my kid says things and I'm like, dang, that's deep. Like she just was like, after we talked about racism so much, she's like, Mom, this does not make any sense. Who cares what someone's skin color is? I
love it.
Bingo. Yes. And she knows this now and she can't unknow it. Right. Yeah. Versus I was taught to be colorblind. Most of us well-intentioned 80s and 90s kids were taught, civil rights solved all that, women's rights solved all those problems. So like, we're good. Just like keep working hard and pull yourself up by those bootstraps. Don't see color. Don't talk about it. It doesn't exist anymore. It's like, what? Come on. Person of color, that is a part of their identity, right? Unfortunately, we've constructed this as a social construct. It's not real, but it is real in today's society, unfortunately. So if you don't talk about it, you can't solve a problem you can't discuss. Anyway, all that to say, full circle, we have started a nonprofit, littleallies.org. So listeners, you can check it out more, but we give materials, education materials, we donate to organizations that are willing to have this candid conversation with kiddos. So summer camps, museums, we've partnered with, STEM programs over the years. Here's a book, here's a discussion guide, here's a bunch of tools, activities. We have a great activity book that we built with a teacher, an elementary school teacher. So you can do these activities, plug and play. You don't have to be a DEI expert to guide this conversation. And that was all based on my own learning about how hard it was for me and how much I needed the tools myself, even as somebody that's very well versed, hopefully, in this work.
Well, it's an evolution. We're always going to be learning in this space. So actually, when we start to, as you mentioned, it's as you start to kind of see it, and to me, I was unconsciously incompetent. I had no idea what I was not believing in, and how I was actually following through on the systemic bias that was out there that I didn't know. And when I started to realize that I cared about other humans, just like your daughter mentioned, for all the reasons that we should, to do the right thing, I realized that I could do better, and I needed to use my privilege more honorably, and to do it with responsibility, and do it with good intentions, and to put myself out there and be vulnerable. I'm never going to stop learning at this point. It's just one of those things. I don't have it just right. And there's been moments where my daughter and my son say, "Dad, you can't say guys anymore." I'm like, I know I keep saying that. It's like my weakness. Like I'll say, "Hey, guys."
Yeah, that's a big one.
I'm trying to get better at that. And I remember my son coming home from school, and there was, the whole questions back about Black Lives Matter versus All Lives Matters. And one of the kids was really talking about All Lives Matter without the full context around it. And I remember my son was just talking about how he was actually telling everybody calm down. Like, let's hear what he has to say so we can all learn from this.
Yeah.
And that's the thing.
Beautiful.
We have that ability to talk to our kids, and then they come back and share it with us. And I'm like, oh my God. Oh, and that's phenomenal. Like, you didn't judge that. Because I think what happens is we hear these words, and we hear someone's creating a situation, it becomes divisive. Oh my God. Versus actually, you can really, because I know we were talking about this a little bit earlier, we say a word and people are reacting versus actually taking it in to say, okay, wait, what part am I playing into this word? What am I reacting to? What am I believing? Is this right or wrong? Or what could I do differently? And my son showed me that day what that means, to be open-minded, to get curious, and to step in and not react.
Yeah, I love that. Like, especially if someone says something problematic, just stay curious. Just stay curious a little longer, right? Because we go right into judgment, especially as adults. Because our brain is wired this way. We're created to make decisions very quickly for our survival. But, when someone says all lives matter, they're not trying to physically attack us. It feels like that, though. Like, for me, my blood pressure goes up. I get sweaty. I just want to pounce on them. Yeah. I get all that. That's instinctual. However, if you just breathe for a second, get the cortisol level down a notch, and just say, "What do you say that? What do you mean? Ooh, I disagree. I have a different perspective, but I want to hear yours first." Right. And Darrin, one of the most powerful conversations I had recently was very much like your son's story. And I'm not perfect at this, but I did have a breakthrough moment with somebody that was a very different political belief. So just put it that way. Here I am last fall, our school board. This is just wicked weird how the school board, it was never meant to be partisan, let alone about DEI, but this is what's happening in our country. So my purple district is no different. So we have the anti-DEI slate, the pro-DEI slate, and all of their marketing materials. So I'm not inventing this. I'm trying to support the pro-DEI for obvious reasons. So I'm at the voting area in the parking lot with this anti-DEI older white man, which no harm there, but doesn't have school-age children, just very interesting situation. So I'm there for 3 hours, this person. And this is going to be a long afternoon, right? Hour 1 did not go well. Lots of small talk about the weather and his back pain and me, whatever.
Nothing of substance.
No, nothing. We're really trying just to keep it superficial. Hour 2, things get interesting because I'm like, I got to take a walk. This is not I got to walk this off. And he's like, well, what do you want me to do? And one of your liberal constituents comes over here. And he says it just like that. And I was like, I'm not aware of this being a political environment. I didn't think the school board elections were supposed to be bipartisan. And he just looks at me. And I was like, don't worry, I'll come back. I'll be right back. So I walk it off and I come back and I was like, did anyone come by? And he's like, no. Okay. I want to hear about your platform. And so I just asked the question and let him talk. And he went on for way too long. And I listened as well as I could and stayed patient. I was hoping he would return the favor and ask me about our platform. She did not reciprocate. Hour 3 comes by. This is a long afternoon. Yeah. I ask more questions. I just plant a couple seeds of things I've heard, studies I've referenced, why I care about this, And at the end of it, he finally turns to me and he goes, I'll tell you, Julie, I have never met someone like you before. this was really an interesting afternoon, and I'm glad I got to meet you today. And it's like, all right. I mean, I learned so much in that conversation. It didn't change my beliefs, and I probably didn't change his beliefs much either, but he'd never talked to someone like me. That's a problem.
Yeah.
We're not talking to each other, and we're not listening to each other, much like your story pointed out. What if like we could just stay curious a little tiny bit longer,
Yeah.
broaden someone's perspective, plant a seed that someone else comes along and waters. It's up to them to grow or not. But
Yeah.
if we're not trying and giving up and judging, then there's no point to this work. Like we can't do this work and stay judgmental. We just can't.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, that's the whole growth mindset perspective, right? If we're stuck in our ways, not willing to take on and listen to other perspectives, because that's really the art, is the ability to actually take those perspectives and make what we have and what we know better. It's not about throwing everything out. I'm with you. I think, planting the seeds is a great way to say it. And if we could all just not bring our emotional selves to react, yet actually care with emotional wanting and being, because that's who we are. We are human. We don't want to get rid of our emotions. I just think we're upfront with our reactions versus actually working together to actually come out stronger and more emotionally connected. And I just feel a weakness too. I just think we get divisive and we don't want to figure out what the end game is. What is the end game? I mean, the reality is, are we trying to be better as humans? Are we trying to do good? Because I could promise you that when I've started to realize the benefits from my awakening, it's much better. I find much more joy. There's more possibilities. The companies and places I've worked, our results are 10 times better. Maybe there's so many things that I was afraid of, I was preserving, so many things that got in the way that I couldn't even see what was possible. And I even use this pink pen all the time as my reminder to be different.
Yeah.
And to look at differences and to accept differences. So, for me, I talk about awakening, Julie. I mean, am I allowed to say awakening these days? And there's so much about the word woke and some other things. Like, what's your take on that?
Oh gosh, they don't like any words we use, right? I mean, if you're against diversity, inclusion, it doesn't matter what language we use. Woke, simply put, was something that was coined by the Black community, the people of color, to talk about I'm not asleep anymore to systemic issues. So if you want to be asleep to systemic issues, have at it. Call me anti-woke, whatever it is. But you raise a really interesting point about where we're at now and what will it take for other people to wake up. And I call it kind of like the white male epiphany. Let's be honest, right?
Mm-hmm.
Well, the representation and concentration of wealth is in white men's hands. That's the state of our country and of the world, quite frankly. So if we don't engage that demographic in this work, we will not succeed. And we have done a crappy job of doing that. And I get in a lot of crossfire. I actually get in a lot of trouble when I speak out about that. People of color don't like that because I'm a white woman. And I'm not blaming white men either. So I either tick them off because they're like, I'm not the bad guy. I'm not saying that. I'm married to a white man. I have lots of white male friends. I enjoy. Interviewed a ton on my podcast too about their epiphany moments. But we have to put ownership. If you have power, if you have privilege, if you have wealth, you need to do a better job of sharing it with other people. And that's the expectation that we have not cultivated as a society. Instead, we encourage the opposite. Hoard your resources, work hard and keep it all. And I don't know about you, but this is why this work makes me better, is when I reach a certain point in my business, we did 2 years ago, we had a very, very profitable record year. I don't need that money. Other people need that money. How am I going? I have an obligation to give that money back to the very people that need it the most. And, I did a bunch of research, and that's when I'd written The Little Allies, and we'd partnered with other nonprofits, and we just weren't getting the traction for the Little Allies materials. And that's why we ultimately built our own, which really caused me a lot of angst because I didn't want to be another, create something else, but there was nothing else like what I wanted to create. And I couldn't get the support from other organizations that were focused on their own mission. So anyway, I'm not perfect, but I love to create kind of a Robin Hood scenario where these huge companies are making record profits and don't even, even in the throes of a recession or whatever we're in with economic uncertainty, they're making most companies are making way more money than they used to. And CEOs are making way more money than they used to. Frontline workers are making less when we adjust for inflation. So why not take it money from the wealthiest bottom lines and put it in the hands of those that need the tools, the resources, the information the most? So that's my one try at being a better human. And that feels a heck of a lot better than getting a paycheck and being a curmudgeon.
I think you're aligned too with the thought of the whole movement around ESG, right? The thoughts of investing and supporting environmental, social, and governance types associations or societies. And it's interesting too, as we think about altruism, I've been reading more about effective altruism and how that's very calculated, and depending on who actually put the calculations together on where investing goes to support different areas. So I always find that's an interesting topic as well. I think it's good for adults too, to your point about the kids are teaching the adults. And so how do, I guess translate that to adults, allyship, and how does that work in the services you're providing with Next Pivot Point? Like, what are you doing? How are you helping people to normalize or feel like they're contributing in different ways? And I also believe it's a two-way street. So I'd love to know your opinion on that too.
Yeah. Well, just to wrap back real quick to your point on ESG, environmental, social governance. This is a thing. It's not going away. Europe is about to pass legislation that will mandate U.S. companies doing business in Europe to do DEI reporting. So I don't like to scare people, but this is real and it's coming. Just get with the program. So that's that. The Little Allies work, it really is for the parents. So even me reading it with my daughter, like, again, she's like, well, what's that? Or I think this. And I read the book at her third grade class a few weeks ago. Oh my gosh, the questions they ask. I mean, they're just right out of the get-go. How does somebody have two moms? And I'm thinking they want to know. This is where adults get scared. They want to know the biological. It's not what she's asking. She was just asking, how do you get, the answer was really simple. All families are different, right? And then everyone starts talking about how different their families are, which was a whole different conversation I was unprepared for. But all that to say, kids aren't judging. They're not being mean. They're asking questions they genuinely don't understand. And what if, as adults, we ask questions we genuinely did not have the answers to? I mean, think about the last time you asked a question where you didn't have an idea of what the response would be. It's not that often. We ask questions as adults that we're confirming what we think we already know. Kids don't do that. That's why the why, and it's like, oh my gosh, I'm in the car with my daughter and I'm like, oh, it's like the 10th question in a car ride. It's hard to stay in that mindset because my brain is just short circuiting and trying to create those mental not trying to create new mental pathways. It's reinforcing the ones that it already has to save energy. She doesn't think that way. And so I just think this kind of highlights what we said earlier about curiosity versus judgment. If we could stay that way as allies. And I know this sounds very simple, but in practice, it is very difficult. Just try to mentally pause. Like, really, like anyone that meditates knows how hard it is to meditate. Like, it's kind of like that. Like, get your thoughts to stop and just be like, whoa, what is this person all about? I mean, just do that with one person and let me know how that conversation goes. I promise you will learn something you didn't know. You will develop more trust and strengthen a relationship with somebody that hopefully matters in your life. If you work together, you're going to have a stronger relationship and get more done together. Like, why don't we take these moments to get to know each other as human beings? Because at the end of the day, we are a social species. We are wired for connection. Anyone that follows Brene Brown's work knows that, one of the most horrible things we can do to a human being is to isolate them. That's why we had so much suicide and alcoholism during the pandemic, because people were isolated. We need each other. We can't survive on our own. And at the same time, when we just want to create these walls against each other as humans, it's the last thing we need. We need each other. And I just say, like, that's my kids. I mean, I'm not an education expert, but I know the power of younger people. I remember being a young person thinking this way, and I wish I could go back to my inner child, but I can't. But what if we could spend more time, having these conversations with kids? It's powerful stuff. And last thing I'll say, technically, the best conversations, at least I have had with young people, is side by side. So go for a walk in the car, I remember a client of mine sharing, he's like, oh my gosh, my mom used to like grill me as a teenager when she got me in the car. It's like you're side by side looking the same direction. So it's a lot easier to have a candid conversation when you're not adversarial looking at each other. So if you want to do it, just have a couple questions in your back pocket. Hey, I thought about this. The Inclusion School podcast I mentioned recently, we interview experts, and so we have a treasure trove of resources on that website, books, videos. There's some great short videos you can watch with your kiddos that are very educational. And you can say, hey, what'd you think? I wonder what you thought about that. Right? I love, I wonder, I'm curious.
Yeah.
What do you think? It doesn't, you don't have to have this like formulaic response or robotic question. That's not what kids want anyway. Just be real. Don't have a script. Just jump in. It takes a few minutes too, because kids will, inadvertently change the subject. Or my daughter will be like, what's for dinner? I'm like, oh, we were just on the cusp of something. But it's a continued conversation, right? So, and we make this mistake. We have Black History Month, Women's History Month. We do this big parade, and then we tune it out the rest of the year. Like, just keep having the conversation. And it's a slow drip. Every few weeks, bring something up. It's not that difficult.
That's good. I love the I wonder as well, because I do think that's transcendent to just being an amazing human and joy and the things that we really care about, love, whatever it might be. I think it's so cool. I also feel that, as you're talking and I'm listening to you talk about certain things, we disagree with things. We're divisive about certain words. Maybe it's a trigger word or maybe it's a belief, but even those words to say, well, even though if I don't agree with you, Julie, hey, I'm interested to learn more. Tell me more. I'm curious. I wonder what that looks like for you, or I wonder how you got here with that.
Exactly.
The same thing as talking with other adults. I love how you're talking about allyship in that manner. You're not saying this has to be some type of DE&I event. That has to be part of some program. And you're talking about it like this can happen tomorrow, today, next week, not as part of a room because we're actually in training. This is about being a good human being.
Yeah. 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 At the end of the day, I'm convinced that unless you're a psychopath, you get out of bed in the morning wanting to do good and to help other people. It's one of the most, you ask 99% of people, you ask, what inspires you? What do you want to do? People it always goes back to a common theme of helping someone in some way. Rarely are people like, I want to make as much money as possible. That might be a motivator for some, but again, for most people, you want to help people. So if you want to be helpful, think about how you can be more inclusive. Think about how you can be a better human.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, as you and I were discussing, the DEI work has gotten polarizing, stigmatized. All the things. There's just a real pushback on it. People don't like the acronym. Okay, throw out the acronym. Tell me whatever word you want to use. I don't give a rip, honestly. So many of my corporate clients are retreating to inclusion. Fine, we'll talk about inclusion. And they'll find something wrong with that too. I can't even fathom what that would be, but it will be polarized. Just embrace the fact we want to be better human beings.
Yeah. How do we get out of the way of the words? I think is something that is a huge takeaway, to not react to the words that we think it really means, and to really inquire and get curious. I think about privilege. I think about power. I think about inclusion. I think about awakening or woke. I think about unconscious bias, and I know you're a trainer, a certified trainer on that. And I didn't realize it, but if I'm someone that wants to actually explore a little bit more, that's listening, is there a simple way, or do you have a tip for us to think about it? Or maybe there's a website to go to test this out? I'd love to get your perspective, and maybe we could talk about it more in some other, maybe a follow-up episode or other things we want to do.
Yeah. Well, good for you for, being aware of your biases. Most people aren't. Most people have them. We have bias in some area of our life. So I always highly recommend, it's not a perfect resource, but it's free, it's anonymous, and Harvard backs it. So it can't be terrible. Implicit.harvard.edu. So that's the implicit association test. It's called Project Implicit, and it's a measurement of unconscious bias. There's like 12 different categories: age, race, religion, LGBTQ, gender. Yeah, most people have bias in at least one of those areas. I have racial bias, right? So I associate white people with power and Black people with oppression. And that is a product of my lived experience. And unfortunately, I have to manage that. And that's up to me to manage that. That's not up to anybody else. So I got to check myself, right? One of the ways I check myself is by diversifying the people I spend time with, making sure I have a robust, people of color I follow on social media, people of color in my close, social circles and in my business. And then 2 is making sure when I do see bias in myself and others, practice the good old flip it to test it. It's one of my favorite tools. Credit to Kristen Pressner's work. Is if this was an opposite gender, race, ethnicity, would it still make sense? Would we still say this? Would we still say, where are you from? When people ask me where I'm from, they actually want to know where I'm from. And when I say Ohio, it suffices.
Yeah.
Someone of a different ethnicity that's born here is asked that question. And people are like, well, where are you really from? Right. That's obviously a very different lived experience than the one I'm having. Right.
Mm-hmm.
And so just acknowledging that, flip it to test it, diversify the folks you spend time with, take the assessment, get to know your bias, and then just watch out for it. When it shows up in the moment, don't be hard on yourself. It's just like you, be kind with yourself, forgive yourself. Oh, shoot, there it is. I got to watch out for that, right? For me, this is ingrained in me as a young person. My mom, love her to death, well-intentioned, but definitely had some racist tendencies. We go into a neighborhood that's people of color. What'd you do? Right? Lock the doors. Right? I was taught from a very young age that conditioned response of lock the doors when I saw people of color. So I got to check that. I got to check that still today. I have automatic locks, and I really try to not default to that conditioning. But I felt myself put the finger on the lock button, and I don't do that in white neighborhoods. I got to rein that in, right? And it doesn't make me a bad person, but it certainly is an opportunity for me to be better.
I can relate, and I'm sure others that are listening can relate. And that's a good simple example. To not beat ourselves up over it and to say, wow, I could do better. I need to acknowledge it. I need to check in on that. And that's the key, is learning. That's getting curious. That's actually taking perspective to do something about it and to grow from it, which is phenomenal. It's taking these tests that you're interested, go out and do that. And I'll certainly put some links to these tests out on the show notes. And certainly you're doing so many amazing things, right? You have books, you have a bunch of services that you're providing with the different corporate folks around the country, internationally, really. I'd love to hear from you. What do you focus on these days, and how can folks actually reach out to you and connect with you? I will certainly put some links to your website and the wonderful work that you're doing, and a copy of the book. I'll put a link out to that book as well. But I'd love for you to just kind of outline, what are you up to, and how can people get to reach out to you?
Yeah. Well, next pivot point, as we referenced earlier, that's our website, all our social media handles. LinkedIn is probably the best place to follow me on social. Seems to be the more healthy alternative on social media nowadays. So Julie Kratz, Kratz, follow me there. And what I strive to do with our corporate clients, we kind of focus on 4 key buckets, or we do focus on 4 key buckets. One is assessment. You got to know your starting place. We got to know what outcomes we're trying to drive for it to be successful, for it to be strategic. That leads to our strategy work, where we'll help you co-create a roadmap, a plan based on why this is important and what you're trying to accomplish. And then we'll also educate folks. So much about it is education, is 80% of the journey. So workshops, live programs, keynotes, that type of thing. And most of it's the exact conversation we had today. I mean, these are the tips we give in our very practical, action-oriented training and speaking events. And then the last piece is leadership teams. So we know this work doesn't work unless leaders are involved. And so I do a lot of coaching. I'm doing a lot of coaching with C-suite leaders right now that are, can be very candid in a group setting about, I don't get this. I don't know how to respond to this. The most common request I'm getting in my one-on-one coaching right now is, how do I have this conversation with somebody that doesn't get it, that doesn't want to get it? How do I listen? Because I disagree with everything they're saying. Now I have to be their leader. This is a real challenge. So if those issues are you're facing those issues, listeners, there's definitely tools, there's resources. It's not impossible. Just like we talked about today, it's one conversation at a time. These conversations matter. We need to keep having them. And if you're in a position of power, privilege, of leadership, it's an obligation for you to care about this. Your team expects you to care about this. Young people will hold you accountable to this. They will be voting with their employment and their dollars. So the runway's running out. Get with it.
I appreciate your courage that you're putting out there with this work and getting getting folks to start to open their eyes a little bit differently. And I appreciate your vulnerability as you're sharing. You don't have it just right yet. You're an expert in this space. And I think it's a good example to lead that way, because we're all in this journey, continue looking in ways to get better, to open our minds to say, hey, we need to do better. We got to unlearn, we got to relearn, we got to do better together. And I love that you're doing that in the capacity in which you're doing it, because there's so many organizations that probably could use that assessment and understand what could be done and what is possible after that.
Yeah.
And I can promise
and that's a big miss if you don't assess. And we didn't do that. People went guns a-blazing. Sorry for the analogy. I probably could have found a better one there. But 2020, it's like, oh, we're going to do all this stuff. And it's like, no one stopped to think, well, what are we trying to achieve? What are the gaps? Because making a corporate statement, I'm not sure solves any particular problem other than making you look good. So we need to challenge things in measurement. I appreciate you underscoring that, because if you haven't measured DEI at your organization, that's a very important thing to do that everyone needs to be doing. And again, you'll be held accountable for doing that, whether it's ESG or mandates that are coming down the road globally. It's just part of the reality of doing business now.
Yeah, and don't do it just to check the box either. I think looking at what's possible, the results that can follow, and when folks are actually genuinely doing the work collectively. There's so many companies that are doing it right. And I was talking to Otis Elevator earlier today, and they're doing all those things the right way. They're expanding. They're looking to become leadership neutral as far as gender equality by 2030. They're at almost 40%. Companies are showing the way. It is possible.
Yeah.
And they can do it.
And they're having better business results. And it's probably a competitive advantage. And their people are engaged. There's just countless studies that show the importance of this work. So it's great to see organizations that are doing it and they're consistent and they're intentional over time, because you have to be for it to work.
Yeah. Thanks for saying all that. And thanks for being a leader in this space. And I appreciate you joining the show. I admire all the work you're doing. Any way I could partner with you, let me know. This is work that we all need to do. We all need to step in to make a difference. And certainly with the world fast approaching with AI and other elements of the world, it's going to continue to change, and we need to change with it. So thanks for being on the show.
Thanks for having me.
Julie is truly an expert in this space, is in the middle of our world trying to do better. No matter where you are on your journey to be more inclusive and welcoming, be honest about your greatest purpose and how you're stacking up against that each and every day. If it's to make the world better or to serve or help all humans grow with possibilities, consider these ideas from today's show. Watch Julie's TEDx about gender equality. Comment on her talk on YouTube or share it with someone else, where you can learn and grow together with an open mind and heart as you share ideas and discuss it. As you watch this talk, think of a female in your life that means something special to you and might open your eyes a little bit differently. Number 2, seek out someone to learn from that is different than your usual path. Consider listening to your kids differently, kids on teams you may coach, or people you meet in your day. Be open to ideas or responses that help you unlearn something and relearn or expand your thinking. Let them know you heard them and how they impacted you. You both will grow from that experience, I promise. Number 3, try an entire day without challenging other people. And stand in to listen with the words Julie suggests to state things like, hey, I'm curious to hear more, or tell me more about how you got to this place, the things that support this belief you are having, or just engage in understanding without combating, reacting, or judging. Number 4, go judgment-free. Judgment is one of the weaknesses of our day. Judgment of each other is one of the gaps we need to overcome to have a more harmonious place where we could all live and thrive. Check it out. Catch yourself if you're judging others, or even yourself. Number 5, be true to yourself without pushing away people and possibilities. Once I figured this out, my life opened up with endless opportunities and transcendent joy. Number 6, feel free to reach out to Julie or me if you would like us to help you transform in the ways that will inspire personal and organizational growth in ways you dream of. Keep taking small steps of action to your highest purpose as your happy, authentic self, and live your possible.
That's all for today's episode. If you liked the show, please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Live Your Possible dares to unlock your fullest potential and become an avenue for others to do the same. Join the community by visiting ignitehappy.com. It's time to discover endless possibilities with equal opportunity for all. See you again next week for more insights on how you can live your possible.